In the last video, we looked at the 7 signs that characterize the beginning of the Gospel of John, and I mentioned at the time that those signs point to the moment of glory, the hour of Jesus' glory, which is the passion and crucifixion of Jesus in John's Gospel. So we turn now to the book of glory, but I just want to begin by reminding us of the signs. And at this point, I also want to just tie in that there are significant discourses in the Book of Signs that relate to the motifs and themes we saw in the prologue and then saw repeated and built in the Book of Signs. So we'll just go through each of these again. In the water to wine at Cana story, the first of the signs, when Jesus said his hour had not yet come, but his mother directed the servants to do whatever he said, we see that followed by stories that pick up some of those themes. Nicodemus talking to Jesus about being born from flesh, or as Jesus says, the importance of being born from above. It's the image of birth and beginning. And then the Samaritan woman at the well, reminded of the marriages that she had been in, and she understands Jesus's knowledge of her marriages to be a sign of his prophetic identity at least, and this draws her into a deeper conversation where ultimately she becomes his apostle, going into the village and bringing out other Samaritans to meet him. The second sign, the royal official's son is healed, and the third sign, the lame man is healed, are followed by controversies with Jewish leaders, and Jesus defends himself or testifies to the truth, saying that a son cannot do anything on his own, but only what he sees his father doing. So tying his intimate relationship to God, to the power he has to heal. And of course, being the Word through which God created everything, the power over life and death, illness and health, is something that he only can wield as the Son of this Father. The fourth and fifth signs, the 5,000 are fed with bread, and then Jesus walks on water, are followed by Jesus' discourse, I am the bread of life, clearly tying not just to the feeding of the 5,000, but also to that story from the book of Exodus when the Israelites are fed manna from heaven. God provides. God has control over nature. The sixth sign is when the man born blind is healed. Now, just before the man is healed, we hear Jesus give a speech, I am the light of the world, the light by which the blind man sees, the light that has the power to heal his blindness and move him from darkness into light. And because the blind man is tested and challenged by the Jewish leaders for claiming that Jesus healed him, the issue of who has authority, proper authority, who is the proper leader, is raised. And so we also hear Jesus speak that he is the good shepherd. He is even the sheep gate through which you must pass to enter the pasture. And finally, the story, the sign of Lazarus being raised from the dead, during which Jesus gives the discourse that I am the resurrection and the life. So we had spoken in the prior video about the signs, but I just want to indicate that they are overlaid again with the stories that follow them and the discourses, particularly that Jesus speaks in their vicinity. But I've arranged them in this sort of colorful flower petal kind of arrangement in the middle for a reason. Because as we turn to the book of glory, what we're going to see is that John is attempting to show us something about the book of glory, or the glorification of Jesus, about who he really is, by clustering these signs and having them build on each other. It's as if the book of glory occupies this center space where all of the signs converge, and we see the true meaning that John wants to assign to these signs that point to Jesus. Now, at this point, what I'd like to do is to remind us of the various themes that we saw in the prologue and also in the various signs. So I'll list them over here on the right. And then what we're going to do is to move through just a few select passages in the book of glory so that I can point out, or you can see for yourselves, how the succession of stories plays with the same themes we saw John building through the book of signs. So the first, in chapter 13, it was the Passover festival. Jesus is in Jerusalem for it. And now we hear that Jesus knew that his hour had come. You'll remember that the very first sign, the wedding at Cana, Jesus said that his hour had not yet come and resisted doing any sign. Now, at the beginning of the book of glory, the hour has come. to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Notice that not only the term his hour has come up again, but we are in a Jewish festival, as we so often are in this gospel. And so you'll remember that even in the story of the water turned to wine at Cana, while it wasn't a festival apart from a marriage, it wasn't a Jewish festival, nevertheless the jars of water that he turned into wine were there for ceremonial washings that were required by Jewish tradition, by the Jewish law. And so there's a connection there to Jewish ritual traditions. Let's move on a little later in chapter 13. Jesus says to his disciples after he's washed their feet, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. But it is to fulfill the scripture, the one who ate my bread," one of the ones whose feet he washed, "has lifted his heel against me." Well, this is our Last Supper scene, but of course, in John's Gospel, this last meal together is the night before the Passover Seder. And so we don't have as much emphasis on the bread and wine of the Passover ritual, because the crucifixion is going to sort of take the place of that, because the crucifixion happens at the moment the lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. But what we do have is this alternative symbol, one we ritualize on Holy Thursday, the washing of the feet. So we are at a meal. There is an evocation of the bread, the wine, the water particularly here, in the washing of the feet. A little further, we now have the arrest scene. Judas brings a detachment of soldiers. They come with their lanterns and torches and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all that was about to happen to him, came forward and said, "Whom are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Of course, they're about to arrest him, but that symbol, that gesture of awe and reverence, signals what is significant about this moment. He is more than Jesus of Nazareth. He is I am. In Jewish scripture, the name God uses for God's self at the burning bush, and in John's Gospel, a name frequently that Jesus uses for himself. The issue of his identity as the Son of the Father is being explored here. And notice too, we're in the middle of the night when they're coming with their lanterns and torches. That's the only way they can see. It reminds one of the story of Nicodemus coming at night. He doesn't quite see. Now, Jesus is in with the high priest, and Simon Peter is outside warming himself. And so the people standing there in the courtyard asked him, "Are you not also one of his disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment the cock crowed. Again, we're in the middle of the night because the cock is crowing the dawn, and the darkness has overcome Peter. It's as if, in a sense, Peter is on trial. Does he accept or reject Jesus? Is he willing to risk testifying to him? Of course, soon, in his own trial by Pilate, Jesus will testify even at risk of his own death, but Peter does not. And so the contrast of who testifies to the truth and who doesn't is even more acute in this gospel that emphasizes testimony so much. In the trial with Pilate, which, by the way, in this gospel is the only trial, there is no Jewish trial, Pilate asks Jesus, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king." And then on his own part, he says, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Notice how that's an implicit challenge to Pilate. If he doesn't listen to Jesus' voice, he doesn't belong to the truth. And we see Pilate asking questions like this frequently in the trial scene. He is in the position of not knowing and ultimately not believing, whereas Jesus is in the position of testifying and laying down the criteria of judgment. If you belong to the truth, you will hear my voice. So it's as if John has flipped the whole trial scene. It's not Jesus on trial, it's Pilate. Also, in recalling, "For this I was born, for this I came into the world," we're right back in the prologue, where we find out why and that he came into the world. So the image of birth, of creation. is called back to mind even here at the moment of his death. Pilate turns Jesus over to the crowd. He says, "Here is your king." And they cry out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate, still seeming ambivalent about this, or not certain that he ought to do this, asks them, "Shall I crucify your king?" To which the chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." That is blasphemy. Now remember, in this gospel, there is no Jewish trial at which the Jews accuse Jesus of blasphemy. Instead, we hear Caiaphas say to himself, after Lazarus is raised from the dead, that the reason he wants to turn Jesus over is he's afraid of the crowd, that they might band behind Jesus as their Messiah, and that will cause a revolt, and many people will die. So here, the blasphemy is never referenced of Jesus, but we hear the chief priests answer, of all people, the chief priests have no king but Caesar. Their king should be God. So who do they follow? Who do they believe in? They're condemning themselves with this statement. Now we turn to the moments when Jesus dies. We're at the cross with Jesus, and you'll notice that his mother is there. Now, throughout the gospel, she's only mentioned twice. In that other occasion, he also calls her woman, and it's the first of the signs, the wedding at Cana, where she is the one who calls him to his hour. Now at this moment when his hour has come, he turns her over to his beloved disciple. We don't know who this beloved disciple is. In fact, he only appears in the gospel at the Passion narrative. He is the one who lays his head on Jesus' chest during the meal. He is the one who leads Peter to the high priest's courtyard because he knows somebody. He's the one, the only male disciple, to be here at the foot of the cross. And ultimately, he will be the one who enters the empty tomb, or actually doesn't enter it, but just looks in, sees the headcloths lying separate from the other wrappings, and believes. So over and over, this beloved disciple is portrayed as the one who is closest to Jesus, even at the worst moment. And here he is at the foot of the cross with woman, with Jesus' mother. Jesus turns his mother over to the beloved disciple. "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. It's as if this beloved disciple is replacing Jesus now. And we now have a new family, the beloved disciple and all of his descendants. That is the community that's writing this gospel. But notice, with the reference to the woman, to mother, being present, we're called back in our minds to the wedding at Cana. It should be in our ears as we're reading these final moments of Jesus, and particularly when we actually get to the moment of his death. When he knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I'm thirsty." They bring him the sour wine. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And the story moves on. Of course, it was the day of preparation for the Passover. The Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because this eve of the Sabbath that was approaching was also the first night of Passover, the day of great solemnity. So they go to Pilate and they ask him to hasten the death of the crucified, to have the legs broken, because if they're only hanging by their shoulders and arms, the pressure on their intercostal muscles will asphyxiate them more quickly. They can't hold themselves up with their legs. So they broke the legs of the others, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. And so just to sort of test that, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. But strangely, and the commentary in the gospel signals that this is a strange event, it wasn't just blood that came out, it was blood and water. Now, while John's gospel doesn't have a Last Supper of the Passover meal with the bread and the wine, nevertheless, blood clearly is connected to wine in the symbolism of the gospel. And the blood and the water that come out of his side, again, take us back to the first sign, the wedding at Cana, when Jesus transformed the water into wine for the guests. Now, there's one other element of the symbolism here of the blood and water coming out, and of the connection of the blood and the water to the story of the water to wine at Cana. Just as we saw that Jesus sort of gave birth to a new community through associating his beloved disciple with his mother in the prior scene, so now we have an image of birth. Yes, it's death. It is the moment of Jesus' death. But just as when a woman gives birth, what comes out with the child? Blood, water. It is death, but it is also life. And so John is deploying this rich symbolism and evoking that extra layer of symbolism of the marriage feast that was at the beginning of the gospel to make of this horrendous story at the center of the Christian tradition the moment of glory. There's so much more to say about this gospel. We haven't even looked at the resurrection accounts and what they signify. We haven't looked at the multiple endings of the gospel. But I hope at least to have illustrated some of the rich symbolism and the layering of symbols that helps John to expose gradually ever deeper levels of what he would like to say about the nature, identity, and purpose of the Christ.